It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about Christianity through the lens of the study of Islam. I'm really excited about this conversation. Dr. David Pinault, thanks for being here, Doctor.
Well, it is a great privilege, Kyle, to be able to talk to you and to reach out to your radio audience.
How did you originally get interested in studying Islam in the first place?
Well, I guess I have, since childhood, I've had a lifelong interest in topics like archaeology, ancient civilizations, languages. I love grammar, and that kind of propelled me out into the world traveling. I've done volunteer work as a digger at archaeological excavations in Israel and southern Jordan.
Really?
So all of those things together really help to stimulate a strong interest in the civilizations and the religions associated with those parts of the world. And at the same time, part of what led me and inspired me to write this particular book is that living in countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, Yemen, Egypt, in all of those countries, I had direct contact with persecuted Christian minority populations. And in countries like Yemen and Indonesia, where there's an underground house church community of Christians, worshiping with them, having the privilege of going to Mass with fellow Catholics in countries like that, all of it really, I guess you could say it led to a renewal of my own personal faith as a Christian, because you see what these folks go through trying to give peaceful witness to their faith and how they are persecuted and abused for that. And it makes you realize what a wonderful privilege it is to be able to grow up as an American in a country where, I can practice my faith. And it just helps me not to take that faith for granted. So the experience of living in Muslim countries, the experience of studying Islam has actually served to deepen my faith as a Christian and strengthen my own self-identity as a Catholic Christian.
Did you ever feel persecuted yourself when you were there?
Well, I have had experiences where people have tried to intimidate me, shown hostility in sometimes pretty direct ways, but I want to emphasize here that nothing I've ever been through can compare to what happens to Christians who grow up and live there.
Sure.
Particularly in areas like Aceh. Aceh is that province Indonesia that is ruled by Sharia law, and actually my experience in Aceh is what inspired the title of the book, because the Indonesian nickname of Aceh province is Serambi Mecca, which in Indonesian means Mecca's front porch. It's called that because of the fact that geographically Aceh, which is in the northern tip of the island of Sumatra, that's the point that's geographically closest in Indonesia to the Arabian Peninsula. And so historically that's been the jump-off point for Muslims sailing on the Hajj or the pilgrimage to Mecca. And so Muslims there, many of them are very, very fervent. And as I said, that province is governed by Sharia law. And I'll always remember the experience of going to Mass with fellow Catholics at a church in Aceh. And I got there just in time for the beginning of Mass, and there was a procession going up to the altar with a young girl bearing a bronze crucifix, the figure of Christ, up to the altar. And it was this powerful image for me, and to me it summed up this whole notion of, giving witness to the faith, even in a surrounding like that, in surroundings that are not very friendly to our Christian faith.
Well, and I think somebody might say, I'm a Christian, I should study the Christian faith. Do you think that people that are Christian should study the Islam faith?
Well, here's the thing. Of course, I'm a professional in the field of Islamic and Arabic studies, so I have a bias. But I would say, first of all, Islam, of course, is worth studying in its own right.
Okay.
But if someone were to say to me, what should I prioritize? I have young people in my family who don't know the Bible, for example. Well, obviously, the priority for us as Christians is to know our own Christian faith. In other words, and I always say this, and I've said this, on the campus where I teach, that the first priority should be to help Christian students become acquainted with their own faith. Now, what I've done is, given the fact that this is my field, I teach courses on Islam and on comparative religion, constantly here at Santa Clara University. And what I do is, the first day of the quarter, the academic quarter, I always say to my students, first of all, you need to know that I am a Catholic Christian, and so you're getting an outsider's perspective on Islam. That's the first thing I tell them. Uh-huh. The second thing I tell them is, look, much of the Quran, much of Islamic scripture is written as an attempt at repudiating the Bible and rejecting many of the basics of the Christian faith. That being the case, then it's impossible to have any sense of what the Quran is talking about unless you know the Bible. So I tell the students, we are going to be reading the Quran in tandem with the Bible. So you see, an awful lot of my students are thoroughly unchurched. I mean, they may be nominal Christians, but in many cases, they know nothing about the faith at all. And so what I do is I use my courses on Islam, yes, to let them know about the Islamic faith, but I use it as a remedial course in Christianity as well. And I would add to this the fact that, and this is something I bring out in the courses I teach, you see, what Islam does is, for example, it acknowledges Jesus, describing him as a prophet, but it claims that Jesus was a Muslim, and it puts words into the mouth of Jesus rejecting beliefs of Christianity, so that although Islam acknowledges Jesus as a prophet, it rejects the notion that he's Son of God. It rejects the notion that he was ever crucified on the cross or rose from the dead. It rejects the Trinity. And nowhere in the Quran does it ever speak of Christ suffering. And so what I point out to the students is that although, of course, the Quran does describe Allah as merciful, the emphasis on Islam is more on Allah's power and majesty. Whereas we as Christians, with St. Paul, we venerate a Christ crucified in weakness. In other words, one of the essential truths of Christianity for me, and this is something I try to communicate to my students in every class that I teach on Islam, is that you study Islam and you realize what's missing from Christian understandings of Christ, especially the notion, and this is unique to Christianity, the notion that God loves the world so much that he gives his Son, and that the divine Son of God enters lovingly into our human condition, which means suffering and solidarity along with us. And for me, I don't know, for you, you probably feel the same way, but anything that I go through in life in terms of difficulties, afflictions, anxieties, fears, sufferings, I can know that Jesus has been a pioneer before me in going through all this because he fully embraced the human condition with all the weakness associated with that, with all the suffering associated with that. And this is a truth that you simply do not find in Islam. And I find that by studying the two side by side, it brings out very sharply those unique treasures of the Christian faith.
Yeah, we're talking with Dr. David Pinault. His most recent book is The Crucifix on Mecca's Front Porch, a Christian's companion for the study of Islam. And what do you think is some of the most common misconceptions that Christians, and maybe Catholics specifically, have about the Islam faith?
Well, my own experience, having taught courses on Islam on the East Coast, the Midwest, and now out in California, I would say actually most Christians know very little about Islam. And I would say that in my experience, and this is something that I'd like to share with you and our listeners, is that very often when Christians and Muslims get together for interfaith dialogue, and they do so out of a goodwill spirit to try to minimize resentments, hatred, and bigotry, all of which are very worthwhile things, of course. I take that as a given. But what happens very often in these interfaith encounters, and I know, having been around for a number of them, what often happens is, in the interest of everybody getting along, after all, we're all children of Abraham, and etc., in the interest of everybody getting along, what often happens is that both the Muslim and the Christian participants in the dialogue minimize the differences between the two faiths. And I think that that does a disservice to both religions. I think actually it is more important than ever today that we learn to identify and give witness to that which is uniquely distinctive about our faiths. And to do that should not be construed as any kind of insult or attack to the other faith.
Yeah, so what would that actually look like? How would you like to see ecumenism and ecumenical dialogue between Muslims and Christians?
Well, actually, I think the form that would be most useful is, instead of minimizing the differences, what I would say is, first of all, if you're having a conversation about the religions themselves, emphasize what's distinct about each faith, first of all. I think that's very important. And then, in my own experience, what I would say is, the thing that one can do constructively, because one cannot and should not make the key theological differences disappear. Instead, what I would say is, perhaps find projects that one can work on together. So I can give you an example in my own life. Although I started a lot of my field research in the Middle East, in Arab countries, in most recent years I've been working a lot in Southeast Asia, for example, in Indonesia. Mm-hmm. And about 11 years or so ago, while I was in Indonesia, I was privileged to make the acquaintance of a Muslim animal rights activist who had established a wildlife rescue association. It's called Pro Fauna Indonesia. And he invited me to essentially their first foreign volunteer working at that wildlife rescue center on the island of Java. And I'm actually too old to be living in the jungle, but it was a fantastic experience. They took great care of me. I loved working with the animals, and that's something at various projects in Southeast Asia I'm continuing to do, the wildlife rescue. And in my experience working in places like that, in places like Indonesia, what these projects do is they bring together people of a variety of faith backgrounds, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, etc., and all of us from different faith backgrounds, but having in common, right, a shared love for animals and the desire to protect them against the wildlife trafficking. And you may be aware of the fact that most of these animals are actually being smuggled into communist China. That's another time together.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm kind of wondering, within Catholicism, there should be a pretty universal dogma and doctrine that we all accept. But within Christianity, there'd be a lot of variation. Is it fair to throw all Muslims in one group of having one single set of beliefs, or is there a lot of variety within Islam?
Well, there is a lot of variety within Islam. There's no question about that. This is a topic that I also talk about in the book, where I give some attention to the origin of the two major denominational groups in Islam. I'm talking about the Sunnis and the Shias. Mm-hmm. But even within each of those denominations, and you have a situation here parallel to what you have in Christianity. For example, you can say, loosely use the word Protestant, but Christians are aware of the fact that you say Protestant, and within that, of course, you've got Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists, etc. And
right.
You have a similar situation in Islam.
Okay.
So you have in many different denominations, at least in theory, all Muslims agree, as they say in the Muslim creed, La ilaha illallah, okay, so there is no God except Allah. Okay, so that's the doctrine of what they call Tawheed, or strict monotheism. And then the second half of their Shahada, or testimony of faith, is Muhammad Rasulullah, okay, that Muhammad is Allah's messenger. Okay, so all Muslims agree on those basics. But beyond that, there are a number of important doctrinal distinctions.
All right. Well, there's so much to learn here, and you've written it all in the book. So where can people get a copy of it?
Well, you can find it on Amazon. Also, if you go to Ignatius.com, it can be ordered from there as well.
All right. Again, it's called The Crucifix on Mecca's Front Porch, a Christian's companion for the study of Islam. Thank you so much, Dr. David Pinault, for joining us today and sharing it with us. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a great privilege, Kyle. Thank you so much, and God bless.